Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third and final lecture in this series of Stimson lectures by John Mearsheimer, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. That's the name of the forthcoming book, is it?
I'm not sure that will finally be the title, but something.
The working title of the forthcoming book from Yale University Press in the Stimson lecture series. And today he is going to be speaking about the case for restraint. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Ian. As I said yesterday and on Monday, it is a great pleasure and an honor to be here. And I feel actually somewhat sad that this is my last lecture, because as you know, I like talking, and this is a fascinating subject. And I could give at least 5 more lectures on it. The first night, I talked about the roots of liberal hegemony, and that talk, as those of you who were there know, was really mainly about liberalism, did not say much about international politics. And then last night, I talked about the false promise of liberal hegemony, and liberal hegemony, of course, is all about international politics. And I made the case that since the Cold War ended, the United States has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, and it's led to nothing but trouble, and it's been very costly as well. And what I want to do tonight is make the case for restraint, and this is an argument that what we need is a more restrained foreign policy. And the way I'd like to proceed is I'd like to start by asking the question, does liberalism encourage restraint? And I'd actually like to go back to sort of Monday night's lecture and just talk a little bit about the nature of liberalism and make the argument that inside of liberalism there is an important strand that would push a great power to pursue a policy of restraint, not a policy of liberal hegemony. And then answer the question of why that strand of liberalism seems to lose out to the more expansive strand. Then I want to talk about restraint, what exactly it is, talk about realism in restraint, because I'll make the argument that restraint is basically a realist foreign policy. Then I want to talk about nationalism in restraint. And as you remember from that first talk, I said that what I was really interested in doing in this book was talking about the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and realism. So here you see the realism and nationalism coming into play to challenge the liberalism. And then I want to talk about where the United States is headed today. That's where I will end. So the first question is, does liberalism itself encourage restraint? And there are actually 2 strands in liberalism. There's a universalist strand and a particularist strand. And what I have done in the past 2 lectures is hammered away at the universalist strand. This is a slide, excuse me, that I used the other night, and that those of you who have been to either one of the previous lectures is very familiar with. And my argument is that when you focus on the individual and you marry inalienable rights to that individual, you get a universalist ideology, right? Because every person on the planet has this set of inalienable rights. And you're focusing on individuals, not countries or nations. You're focusing on individuals, and they all have these rights. So you see that powerful universalist tendency. And I've made the argument, of course, that what that does is inexorably lead to a foreign policy where you try to spread liberal democracy all over God's little green acre. But inside liberalism, there's also a particularist strand. Liberalism's particularist strand is based on the fact that it's impossible to agree on first principles. Remember, I stressed that at great length in the first lecture. Liberalism is based on the assumption that individuals cannot reach agreement on universal truth. There are always going to be disputes. So it's impossible to agree on first principles, and therefore it's imperative to adopt a live and let live political order. This is why liberalism privileges liberty and tolerance. This is what I love about living in liberal America. Right? There's a great emphasis placed on giving people a lot of space to lead their lives the way they want to. And we emphasize things like tolerance and peaceful conflict resolution. These are wonderful values. So, it's kind of modus vivendi liberalism. And then they say, shouldn't this basic logic apply to relations among states, just as it applies to relations among individuals? Shouldn't we, as liberal America, tolerate the fact that China has no interest in being a liberal state and prefers to be an authoritarian state? Or if someone wants to create a fascist state, why should we care? According to liberalism, you're not supposed to be able to say that liberalism is better than fascism or authoritarianism or communism. Take your choice. According to liberalism, right, people can't agree on first principles, and therefore you want to give people plenty of room to live their life the way they see fit. Well, why doesn't the same argument apply to states? Why aren't we more tolerant? Again, if you go back to the Universalist strand, there's no tolerance there. Remember that Michael Doyle quote I put on the screen yesterday? Where Michael Doyle basically says any non-liberal or illiberal state is at war with its people. Whew, if you believe that, and you're off to the races, right? But again, there's a particularist strand as well as a universalist strand. But what's clear is that the universalist strand wins out. And the question is, why is that the case? And I'm not 100% sure, but it's probably because liberals tend to believe that they have discovered at least one important truth. They're basically violating their core precept that you can't reach agreement on first principles. Liberals are basically saying that liberal democracy is the best political order and there is no acceptable alternative. But you're not supposed to be able to say that. But that's certainly the way they act. So all of this is to say, I think if you look carefully at liberalism, one could argue that really it should lead to a policy of restraint, a modus vivendi type foreign policy. But of course it doesn't. Okay. Restraint. What's restraint? I'm putting forward the argument that the United States should adopt a foreign policy of restraint. First of all, it's a realist foreign policy. And one of the really difficult tasks that I face in giving this presentation and writing this book is that most Americans hate realism and they love liberalism. And anyone like me who comes along and says we should adopt a realist foreign policy and abandon a liberal foreign policy really has a tough sell in front of him or her. Okay? But restraint is a realist foreign policy, and I'll explain why that's a good thing. Whether you agree with me is another matter. Restraint also pays significant attention to the power of nationalism, a theme that I've beaten hard in the previous two lectures. Policy of restraint basically calls for getting out of the business of spreading democracy or promoting democracy around the globe, and especially at the end of a rifle barrel. My view is if you want to spread democracy around the world, the best way to do it is to be the city on the hill, right? Have a model democracy at home, and then you can expound to other people what you think the virtues are of liberal democracy, and then leave it up to them to decide what to do. But you don't want to purposely try to spread it with aggressive policies. That's what restraint is basically all about. Okay, realism and restraint. The essence of realism. Realism focuses on great powers, not minor powers. For realists, the states that really matter are the great powers in the system. And the only time that minor powers really matter is when those minor powers are adjacent to great powers. Korea and Poland are two good examples, right? Poland matters because it's sandwiched in between Russia and Germany, or the Soviet Union and Germany, or way back when, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia. Poland matters. Korea matters because Korea is sandwiched in between Japan, China, and Russia. The three countries that have the worst geographical location in the world are Korea and Poland. And now I think you could probably throw in Ukraine, right? These are countries that really are in the wrong location, right? And they're minor powers, they matter. But by and large, realism is a theory that focuses on the great powers, and it focuses on the balance of power, right? The argument that realists make is that those great powers care greatly about how much power they have relative to the other great powers in the system. Realists, as you know, pay little attention to domestic politics. Realists basically treat states as black boxes. It doesn't matter to most realists whether a state is a democracy or an authoritarian state. The structure of the international system in the realist story basically forces most states to behave in similar ways, right? And you can see where Americans would hate a theory like that, because Americans believe that the world is populated by good guys and bad guys, and we're the good guys, and other states that look like us are also good guys, but everybody else is a bad guy. And it's kind of consistent with liberal hegemony, right? And that's why we want to make all of the states in the world liberal democracies, because they then all look like us. And if we're the good guys and everybody looks like us, that means you have a planet that's populated by good guys. And in a planet that's populated by good guys, you can't have anything but happy outcomes, right? That's the liberal story. The realist story is it just doesn't matter, right? And the realist story is that the big enchiladas in the system are going to compete with each other. And they're occasionally going to fight wars with each other. Now, very important to understand that there's a distinction between defensive realists and offensive realists. And I want to talk about the defensive realists. The defensive realists are a very interesting lot. Their basic message is that the structure of the international system encourages states not to go to war with each other. States, they say, should concentrate on defending the balance of power, not trying to change the balance of power. It's a really quite interesting argument. And the key reason for this is balancing behavior. If the three of us are great powers, and I start to accumulate more power, these two other states are going to get very nervous. They're going to form a military alliance, and they're going to try and contain us. The defensive realists would say, look at what happened to Napoleonic France. They got greedy and they got crushed by a balancing coalition of 5 European states. Look at what happened to Imperial Germany. Look at what happened to Nazi Germany. Look at what happened to Imperial Japan. They got aggressive, balancing coalitions formed, and they were crushed. The Germans should have just sat still. The Japanese should have just sat still. They were in the catbird seat. No need to be aggressive. And when you are aggressive, you get crushed. So you have defensive realists like my good friend Charlie Glazer, who wrote a famous article called Realists as Optimists. Right? So you can see why these guys like restraint, right? Because realism leads to no war. Here's Mark Trachtenberg, another good friend of mine, historian, first-class historian. These are some quotes from an article that he wrote. realism is at heart a theory of peace, right? Power is not unstable. It's impractical idealism, that's liberal hegemony, that leads to endless conflict. Serious trouble developed only when states failed to act in a way that made sense in power political terms, right? So the case from Restraint, from a defensive realist point of view, right, really leads to a remarkably peaceful world. Now, as many of you know, there are offensive realists out there in the world like me who think the defensive realists are wrong. I believe that the structure of the system is not benign. It encourages states to compete with each other for power, right? States constantly want to improve their position in the balance of power. And for me, the ultimate goal is to be the hegemon in the system. And sometimes states will go to war to achieve that end. I do not believe, like Mark Trachtenberg or Charlie Glazer or Ken Waltz or Steve Van Ever or Jack Snyder, all of these defensive realists, that structure is benign. I have a much more Hobbesian view of the world. Still, even offensive realists like me, right, would argue that if you follow the precepts of my theory, you'll have a less warlike world than you will following the precepts of liberal hegemony. And why is that the case? 3 reasons. Here's the first. First, realists are only willing to fight in limited areas of the world. Liberal hegemonists want to fight everywhere because they're interested in spreading liberal democracy all over the planet. There is no area of the world that is unimportant from a strategic point of view for a liberal hegemonist. They don't prioritize. There are no priorities. For a realist, that's not true at all. During the Cold War, the United States was interested in competing with the Soviets all over the planet. Realists said this is ridiculous. There are only 3 areas of the world that matter for the United States: Europe, in those days we used to say Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Those are the 3 areas you fight and die. The rest of the Middle East? No. Africa? No. Central Asia? No. Southeast Asia? No. It's no accident that every realist except Henry Kissinger was opposed to the Vietnam War. It's a strategically unimportant area. You only fight in areas where there are great powers, or in the case of the Gulf, a critical resource, oil. But again, for liberals, a very different story. Reason number 2. Realists understand, even offensive realists like me, understand that balancing behavior takes place. I believe that if China continues to grow in terms of economic and military power, and it begins to assert its influence in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, over Taiwan, and in other places on its periphery, there'll be a very powerful balancing coalition that forms against it. And there'll be limits to what the Chinese can do. This is the defensive realist argument. I think they take it too far. They don't understand that sometimes states don't balance effectively, and there's opportunities to acquire power on a part of the aspiring hegemon. But the point here is all realists understand basic balancing logic. Liberals don't, because liberals believe that realists like me, and even realists like Mark Trachtenberg, are products of the 17th century. We're old think. We're dinosaurs. So they just think you can, this gets back to my discussion of NATO yesterday, they think that you can march NATO right up to Russia's borders and it's not going to matter to the Russians. Realists say this is crazy. You march NATO up to Russia's borders, you're going to have big trouble. No surprise that you had a war over Georgia in August 2008, and that you have a war in Ukraine starting in February 2014. basic balance of power logic. But liberals don't believe in balance of power logic. And what I'm saying to you here is that if you understand realist logic, it makes you much more cautious. And that gets to my third point. It's not something that's peculiar to realism, but it does tend to be peculiar to realists. Realists are basically Clausewitzians. Realists, for the most part, pay a lot of attention to military affairs. They read Clausewitz. They take him very seriously. They study military history. Liberals don't. And when you read Clausewitz and you study military history, you understand you're in the realm of unintended consequences. Anybody who goes to war thinking this is going to be easy, the way all these boys and girls in the Bush administration, and even outside the Bush administration, thought when we went into Iraq in 2003, these people live in a dream world. It's just not the way international politics works. You go to war, it's basically a crapshoot. This is the realm of unintended consequences. Incredibly complicated enterprise war. How it all turns out, hard to predict. Of course, sometimes you go because the potential benefits far outweigh the costs, and you think the likelihood of success is quite high. But realists tend to be very cautious. So the point I'm making to you here is you have this group of defensive realists who believe that the structure is remarkably benign. So if you adopt a realist foreign policy, you get no war. Then you have realists like me who don't accept that view, who think that realism does lead to a rather Hobbesian world. But nevertheless, even for realists of my stripe, you'll get a less aggressive foreign policy than you get with liberal hegemony. Because again, with realists, you get priorities, respect for balancing behavior, and respect for the fact that war is an enterprise that is very hard to predict. Realism and the two big fiascos. In my lifetime, I could not think of any two greater fiascos than the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. As I said to you before, every realist opposed the Vietnam War. The two principal thorns, in my opinion, in LBJ's Heine during the run-up to Vietnam were Hans Morgenthau and Walter Lippmann, both card-carrying realists. George Kennan was opposed to the war. Ken Waltz was an adamant opponent of the war before the war went south in 1968. He was an opponent in 63, 64, 65. And with regard to the Iraq War, virtually every realist, again except for Henry Kissinger, opposed the Iraq War. Thought it was a boneheaded idea to invade Iraq. So the point that I'm trying to make to you is if you adopt a realist foreign policy, it's clearly not an idealist foreign policy. There's no question about that. But you're going to get a lot less murder and mayhem in the system, and you're not going to end up with a militaristic state called the United States of America. You're going to get a restrained foreign policy, which I think is a good thing. Now, if you could convince me that liberal hegemony works, then I'd have real problems arguing with you, because it works. And even though the costs may be greater, the benefits are really wonderful. But it doesn't work. It leads to disaster. So I say, from a realist perspective, we need a more restrained foreign policy. Bottom line, realism is not a recipe for peace, but it's more peaceful than liberal hegemony. Now, let me turn to nationalism and restraint. Remember, I have a double-barreled shotgun here, realism and nationalism. Key point you want to keep in mind about nationalism, it makes conquest very hard. And that has consequences. Two consequences. And I want to lay those consequences out. And then I want to talk about the Domino Theory in Vietnam, which some of the older dogs in the audience will remember. First of all, because conquest is hard, that means the United States should be very wary about trying to conquer other states, right? And second, you want to remember that the ability of your adversary to conquer other states is also greatly limited by nationalism. So what I'm saying here is if you understand nationalism, you understand the power of nationalism, it's going to make you very cautious about going on a rampage or trying to conquer other countries. And it's going to make you less worried when your adversary starts to try to conquer other countries. Remember what I told you about my views on Afghanistan in 1979. When the Soviets went into Afghanistan in 1979, virtually everybody in the world I operate in was apoplectic. Oh my God, they're on the march, right? They've just conquered Afghanistan, right? Where are they going to go next? Probably Iran, who knows? My view is exactly the opposite. They've just jumped into a giant quagmire. This is wonderful news. Wonderful news. Right? So the point is, you don't want to jump into Vietnam if you're the United States. And if the Soviet Union decides that they want to jump into Vietnam, by the way, the Chinese, you remember the Chinese? Chinese and the Soviets helped the Vietnamese beat us in Vietnam. We lost in 75. Then in 79, the Chinese invaded North Vietnam. And they got their snouts whacked. Surprise of surprises. First it was the French, then it was us, then it was the Chinese. That's a place you want to stay out of, right? And if you're dealing with an adversary that decides it wants to go into Vietnam, well, be my guest, right? Good luck. So let's talk a little bit about the domino theory. The domino theory goes like this. It says that communism is, like liberalism, is a universal ideology. And what happens is that if the Soviet Union succeeds in Vietnam, then Thailand will fall, Indonesia will fall, Singapore will fall, Japan will fall, Korea will fall, eventually the dominoes will fall in Europe, and eventually the big domino, the United States, will fall. Right? And again, it's based on the notion that one, conquest is easy, and two, when you conquer those other countries, what will happen is that other countries will just bandwagon because, first of all, they'll find communism very attractive. They'll find communism very attractive for ideological reasons. But secondly, they'll understand that they're going to be conquered next. Just to take this out of context, the domino theory and how it applies to the Bush doctrine. Remember I said yesterday, the Bush doctrine called for knocking off regimes in the Middle East and replacing them with liberal democracies. And the first place on the train line was Iraq. But Iraq was not the last place. We were then going to do Syria, do Iran. When the Israelis caught wind in January 2002, we wrap up the war in Afghanistan, or at least so we think, in December 2001. And then in early 2002, we're getting the shotgun loaded to go into Iraq. The Israelis catch wind of that. They send a high-level delegation to Washington, and they say, are you crazy? Iraq is not the principal threat in the region. Iran is. And the Israelis want us to do Iran. The administration and the neocons on the outside say, relax, we're going to do Iran after we do Iraq, or if we do Syria after we do Iraq, by the time we roll up Iraq and then roll up Syria, the Iranians will throw up their hands and jump on the bandwagon. Right? That's the domino theory. And again, it's not surprising at all, because you see a very powerful military actor, the United States, that can conquer states easily and that has this political ideology, liberalism, that it believes in. So it's domino theory logic. But back to the Cold War, we were worried stiff that the Soviet Union would conquer this country, conquer that country, and do it very easily. And then this transnational ideology called communism would help facilitate the fall of all the dominoes. including the United States at the end of the story. Okay? So how does this affect U.S. behavior? We fight in Vietnam. Right? Read Fred Logevall's terrific book on Vietnam called Choosing War, which is the best book I've read on why we went into Vietnam. One of the principal reasons we went into Vietnam is almost everybody in a position of power at that point in time, including huge chunks of people in the public, believed in the domino theory. They believed that we had to stop them in Vietnam because if we didn't, dominoes would fall. Right? What's the fate of the domino theory? The domino theory. It's a joke, right? Any good realist understands that the domino theory is a joke. First of all, conquest is really difficult. You know what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. You know what's happened to us in Afghanistan. You know what happened to the British in Iraq. You know what's happened to us in Iraq. You know what happened to the French, the Americans, and the Chinese in Vietnam. Nationalism is a real obstacle to conquest. So the idea that you could have easy conquests throughout Southeast Asia, which was what we were thinking about in the 64-65 period, not going to happen. And then with regard to the ideology, this transnational ideology, communism is no match for nationalism. You run nationalism up against communism, nationalism will win every time. Have you noticed where the Soviet Union's gone? Right? It's broken up into its series of constituent nation states. Remember the Sino-Soviet split? Oh, by the way, China, communist state, invaded North Vietnam, communist state. Oh, by the way, why did they do that? Because Vietnam, communist state, invaded Cambodia, communist state. Doesn't sound like that transnational ideology had all that much appeal, right? Nationalism, very powerful force. And of course, when we first went to war in Vietnam, I'm old enough to remember this. I was young at the time, but the argument was that the reason the North Vietnamese were so fearsome, and they were fearsome, right? Nobody went into combat against the North Vietnamese had any doubts about that. These were tough hombres. The reason they were so fearsome, so they said, was because they were communists. But with the passage of time, we came to understand that that was fundamentally flawed line of argument. They were so tough because of nationalism, and that's what made conquest so hard. So, my point to you, if you had to do the Cold War all over again, this is how I'd do it. I'd be relaxed. I wouldn't worry about the spread of communism. Hardly at all. And I certainly would never invade a country like Vietnam. I'd stay out. Because the domino theory doesn't work. And I would argue that if we become engaged in an intense security competition with a rising China, which I think is likely to happen if China rises, I think the last thing we want to do is start invading countries for fear of a domino theory-like effect as a result of Chinese aggression. And if anything, if the Chinese get into the business of invading countries that they think they can conquer and facilitate some kind of domino effect on their part, not going to work. So what I'm saying to you is that both nationalism and realism push the United States toward restraint. Restraint, on the other hand, is anathema to advocates of liberal hegemony. I've tried to make that point clear in the first two lectures. So realism points in one direction, and liberal hegemony, or liberal foreign policy, points in the other direction. Okay, where's the United States headed? What does the future hold? I think there are two possible future worlds. The first future world is multipolarity, and that's a consequence of China's rise and the continued resurrection of Russia. Most people I know think that this is the direction that we're headed in. Most people think we are now entering multipolarity, that we're transitioning out of unipolarity. It's hard to measure polarity, but even if you don't think that we've reached multipolarity at this point, most people believe it won't be long before we do. And then the other possibility is unipolarity. And this is the case where China stumbles badly and Russian power declines over time. And this is the argument that we will be more powerful in the year 2050 relative to everybody else than we are now. You all understand, just to give you a feel for this, that America's three principal competitors from the 20th century, Russia/Soviet Union, Japan, and Germany. Let's think about World War I, World War II. Russia, Germany, Japan. All are declining powers, largely for demographic reasons. All of these countries are going to undergo significant demographic decline. And the United States is in good shape demographically. The only two countries that are really in good shape demographically over time are India and the United States. The Chinese also have quite significant problems, right? But our three principal competitors are going to be much less powerful relative to us in 2050 than they are now. There's only one country on the planet that can give us a run for the money, and that's China. And if the Chinese were to stumble really badly, I'm not saying that's likely, I don't think it's likely, but if they were to stumble really badly, we would be more powerful relative to every other state in 2050 than we are today. And we would be free to pursue liberal hegemony again. Okay? Okay, so a multipolar future. If China continues to rise, Russia's resurrection from the dead continues, it's the end of liberal hegemony. It's just over. This is the point that I have made on a number of occasions. You cannot have liberal hegemony in bipolarity or multipolarity. You can only have it in unipolarity. Because if you're in a bipolar system, or you're in a multipolar system where the United States is one of the poles, the United States has to pay attention to the other great power or powers, and it has to engage in balance of power politics. It cannot afford to pursue a liberal foreign policy in any significant way, maybe somewhat on the margins, but the essence of a great power's foreign policy in a bipolar or multipolar world is almost always going to be realism. So, if we do move into multipolarity, liberal hegemony is gone. What if we don't? What if we have a unipolar future? As I say, it's a fertile ground for more liberal hegemony. More liberal hegemony. And therefore, the $64,000 question is whether or not it's possible to sell a foreign policy of restraint in a unipolar world to a country like the United States, to the sole pole. Uncle Sam is the sole pole, thoroughly liberal country. We've tried this once before. We're back in unipolarity. Can we sell a policy of restraint? This is the Montero template that I put up yesterday. This is from Nuno's book on unipolarity. And you remember I pointed out that Nuno argues that in a unipolar world, the unipole has three options. The unipole can go home because it's so powerful and secure. Number two, it could stay involved abroad and use its power to maintain the status quo. Or three, it could stay involved abroad and use its power to alter the status quo, engage in serious social engineering. And of course, as I said yesterday, and you folks all surely understand, the pursuit of liberal hegemony is number three. And restraint could be one or two, and I would argue that restraint could be somewhere in between one and two. Number one is basically isolationism. Isolationism is a policy of restraint. And given the three options that Nuno puts on the table, I think number two is also a policy of restraint. So you could just have a foreign policy where the United States pretty much stays where it is, but doesn't try to reshape the globe in its own image. For my purposes, I'd prefer a policy that's somewhere between numbers 1 and 2. I don't want to get into this in any detail, but I'm not an isolationist, so I don't want to, practice come home America. But at the same time, if I had my druthers in a unipolar world, I would not stay involved abroad in every region of the world. I'd pull back in a lot of regions. I'd certainly pull back American forces from Europe. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make to you is that a policy of restraint actually in practice involves something along the lines of 1 or 2 in Nuno's template or somewhere in between. But that's what we're talking about. Now, are there any reasons for optimism? Optimism about the possibility of adopting a more restrained foreign policy and unipolarity? There are some reasons. First of all, the decision to initially adopt a policy of liberal hegemony is different than the decision to continue it at a critical decision point or the decision to go back to it after a brief hiatus. And my argument is that it's almost impossible to prevent a liberal unipole that hasn't tried liberal hegemony from trying it, right? Because the DNA of a liberal hegemony is such that it's very hard to resist the temptation to reorder the world in ways that you think are of great advantage to you and all of humanity. So I think the initial decision to adopt unipolarity is almost impossible to combat. To adopt liberal hegemony is almost impossible to combat. But a subsequent decision to do it, once you've run the experiment, you've seen what the costs are and what the benefits are and the likelihood of success are, I think you stand a pretty good chance of combating it. There are other factors too. There's actually little public support for liberal hegemony. It's basically an elite-driven enterprise. You want to remember that George W. Bush got elected in 2000 running against nation building and arguing that what we have to do is pull in our horns and not try to reshape the globe. George W. Bush, as a presidential candidate, was very critical of the Clinton administration for being far too ambitious on the foreign stage. And he was elected, and then he became the most ambitious foreign policy president in our history. He was a liberal hegemonist par excellence. Read his second inauguration address. Read a number of the speeches that he gave at places like AEI. George W. Bush sounds just like Woodrow Wilson. There's no better spokesperson for liberal hegemony than George W. Bush. That may be hard to believe, but I'm not exaggerating. It's really quite remarkable. But anyway, he ran as a candidate calling for restraint. Go back and read Condoleezza Rice's famous piece in the January-February 2000 issue of Foreign Affairs, where she, who was very close to George W. Bush, laid out his foreign policy. It's all there. And then you remember Barack Obama. Barack Obama got elected on the platform that he was going to pursue restraint. And he, of course, failed. And he basically admitted he failed in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in his last year in office. But he was interested as a candidate in restraint, and he got elected, and George W. Bush got elected. And as you heard me say yesterday, Donald Trump Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony really hard. He challenged almost every element of the strategy, and he got elected. Right? So the public has no problem electing leaders who are opposed to liberal hegemony and are in favor of restraint. But the problem is once those leaders are in office, they seem to go in the other direction. But anyway, the public could be mobilized. The US also has a rich history of restraint. Stephen Kinzer has this new book out, terrific book, you should read it if you have an opportunity, that deals with the first great foreign policy debate in the United States regarding whether or not we should go abroad and intervene in the politics of other states in a big way, or we should basically pursue a policy of restraint. And it's a debate that takes place after the Spanish-American War in 1898. It's a huge debate, and Kinzer lays it out in great detail. And of course, the restrainers lose. But Kinzer makes the point that if you look at the history of debates about American foreign policy over the course of the 20th century, you see that the restrainers are there in force at almost every key decision point. And actually, in the 1930s, when the United States was an isolationist country, the restrainers were in the driver's seat. I don't think that was a good thing, by the way. I think isolationism was not in America's national interest. And I think it's fortunate that we got into the war. But the only point I'm trying to make to you here is that restrainers, in the form of isolationists, were very powerful at that point in time. And after World War II, there was a huge debate between restrainers, isolationists again, and people who wanted to use American military force broadly. Moreover, I do think that states learn and they have agency. We've seen what happens. This gets back to my earlier point. This is not, liberal hegemony is not something that we haven't tried before. We've tried it now. We've run the test, we've run the experiment, and there's no reason that we can't change things. And then I would argue there's an emerging counter-elite of restrainers in this country. There are growing numbers of people who are disenchanted with what the United States has been doing and who think it would be smart for us to pull in our horns to pursue a more restrained foreign policy. So I think for all these reasons, there's a good chance that restraint could carry the day. Nevertheless, the majority in the foreign policy establishment, the blob, right, is deeply attached to liberal hegemony. And they'll do everything they can to stymie restraint. My good friend Steve Walt has recently finished a book manuscript that deals with the blob and its love of liberal hegemony. And he makes a somewhat different argument than I do, but it reinforces the point that the blob has a deep-seated interest in combating restraint and continuing to pursue liberal hegemony. But Steve's basic argument is not like mine. Mine is that liberalism as an ideology, right, provides a very powerful impetus for pursuing liberal hegemonies. Steve's argument is that it's basically a jobs program for the liberal elite, right? That all these people in Washington have jobs that depend on having the United States run the world, so that they can occupy very important positions in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the National Security Council. And if you begin to shrink all those institutions, right, and you don't have military bases all over the world, and you're not interfering in the politics of every country on the planet, right, people are going to start losing jobs. And lots of people graduating from Yale who want to become part of the foreign policy establishment. You know that, right? You want to go out and help run the world. And if the United States pulls in its horns, what are you going to do? You may have to go to graduate school and get a PhD in political science. Oh my God. Or in history. right? You know, you'd rather go to law school or something, or go to the Kennedy School, get a degree, and then go out and run the world, right? It's a jobs program. It doesn't contradict my argument. You understand, John has made a very different argument here over 3 days. John's argument focuses on liberal ideology and says that that ideology is deeply wired into the American body populace, especially the elites, right? And therefore, we pursue this policy, liberal hegemony, because we are in a unipolar world. That's the argument. Steve has a different argument, but it reinforces my argument. And his argument, again, is it's basically a jobs program for the elite. So they'll fight mightily to prevent us from pursuing a policy of restraint. My bottom line, final slide, I think China is likely to continue rising, and I think liberal hegemony will be off the table. And the really interesting questions down the road will have to do with the US-China rivalry. So when Ian invites me back to talk the next time, there will be little discussion of liberal hegemony and much discussion of basic realpolitik behavior in East Asia. That's what I think is likely to happen. So we won't have to worry much about liberal hegemony. But the problem with that is that the United States then ends up with a peer competitor, China. Do we want that? I think I'd rather have unipolarity and run the risk of returning to liberal hegemony rather than see China turn into a peer competitor. But again, if China becomes a peer competitor, liberal hegemony goes away. In the event the world resorts back to unipolarity, which I'd prefer to see over continuing rise of China for good realist reasons, it's hard to say whether restraint will carry the day. I don't know. I think there are some good reasons for optimism, but there are also some good reasons for pessimism. So on that note, I will end, and I will gladly take questions from the audience.
You mentioned that Europe and the Persian Gulf would remain of interest to optimistic version of your realism. I don't understand the Persian Gulf argument, because if the US goes renewable energy, that goes away. We see this already in the import-export balances. And second, I don't see the European argument, although I come from Europe and I'm well aware of the history. Frankly, only this country is made up of Russia, meaning Alaska, Mexico/Spain, and of course overseas possessions of the former UK and France. But otherwise, the US is disassociating long-term from Europe, and Europe is willing to let this go over the next 2 decades once it learns how to defend itself. So why can you make
let me ask you a question. When you say when Europe learns how to defend itself, what does that mean? What Europe is not a country. It's a series of countries, isn't it? Or aren't those isn't Europe comprised of a series of sovereign nation states? How does Europe defend itself? I don't mean to be provocative, but I'm always puzzled when people use that rhetoric.
Well, first of all, you used the term Europe, so I took your term. And Europe is something, at least the European Union is something between something semi-cohesive, and if in doubt, during crisis, it falls back to its essentially confederation, what it is by default. But the core countries in Europe more or less have realized the US is not ultimately willing to defend it in the very long run, or at least they run the risk, so in the end will have to arm themselves. But of course they have difficulties to sell this to domestic audiences.
Okay, let me take your question first on the Persian Gulf and then go to Europe. On the Persian Gulf, if we reach a point where oil doesn't matter, right, where for some reason or another there are other ways of fueling these economies, then the Persian Gulf is not going to matter, okay? Because the United States cares about Europe and East Asia, because that's where the great powers are. But obviously there are no great powers in the Gulf. There's oil in the Gulf. But in your scenario, oil doesn't matter much anymore, then it's not going to be of great strategic importance. So I think we're in agreement on that. With regard to Europe, where I think there's a bit more disagreement between the two of us, look, I think there are two good reasons for staying in Europe. My defensive realist friends who I was talking about before, they want to stay in Europe because they believe it's important to preserve the peace in Europe. And their argument is that if you take the United States away and NATO collapses, right, you'll have the Russians and the Germans competing with each other. The Germans and the French will not trust each other. The British will be separate from the states on the continent. And if you have a war in Europe, right, that will mean the United States will have to come back in, and this will have economic consequences for us. So it's better just to stay there, and in Joseph Joffe's terms, remain as the American pacifier. We are the underpinning of stability. We, the Americans, are the underpinning of stability in Europe. And let's just keep it that way, okay? So that's one way of thinking about Europe. But it assumes, of course, that you'll have war among European states, that the EU is not enough to prevent that by itself. That's not my view. My view is that the United States should only go into Europe with military force if there is one state that threatens to dominate all of Europe, be that Imperial Germany in 1914, Nazi Germany in 1939, and the Soviet Union in 1945. Right? The United States has to come in to make sure that none of those, not three countries, dominates all of Europe. And when I look at Europe today, there's no state that threatens to dominate all of Europe. Germany, as I said, is depopulating. It's getting weaker and weaker. I believe Germany has about 19 million more people than France and Britain today. If you look at, I think it's UN demographic projections out to the... Pardon?
30 million more than France, and roughly 20 more. It's 83.5 million Germans. Last latest census.
Okay, I'll give you that. But I do think you're wrong, but I'll give it to you. Let's go out to the year 2050. The demographic projections put France, Britain, and Germany all the same size demographically. It's because the Germans are declining so rapidly, right? So Germany's not a problem. Russia's not a problem. Russia's a declining great power in large part for demographic reasons. So why are we in Europe, from my point of view? Again, my friends who want to just preserve the peace there, we are a peacekeeper, they'll stay. But I'm not interested in preserving the peace. I'm just worried about a dominant power in the region. The area I would stay in is China. Is East Asia because of the Chinese, right? That's the argument. But so I'm not that interested in staying in Europe, but other people are. Yes, sorry.
You haven't mentioned economic interests in terms of the conflict or whatever, the debate between liberal hegemony and realist policies. Do you think that there are certain economic interests or branches of the economy or whatever you want to put it that tend to push one or favor one type of policy, or is it purely in the realm of ideology? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would just change the word purely in the realm of ideology to purely in the realm of politics,
Okay.
but which I think is completely consistent with what you said. It's a great question, and I haven't thought much about it. But I think that what I'm saying is that it really is all about politics. Because you're raising the question about the differences between liberal hegemony and realism, right? And you're saying, is there an economic factor that discriminates A from B? And I think the answer is no. What makes me nervous about this is because I'm a political scientist and I focus on geopolitics, I almost instinctively go for the politics and I tend to forget the economics. So I'm saying to myself, as you're asking the question, maybe I'm just forgetting the economic dimension. But I don't think so. I think there's no real economic dimension that explains the differences between the two. I think liberalism is really all about, it's all about spreading liberal democracy. And realism is all about the balance of power. Now, some people might say that liberalism emphasizes the importance of creating an open economic order, an open international economic order. I think that's certainly true, but so do realists, right? Everybody agrees that the open international order that we created roughly from 1945 up until the end of the Cold War, and then worked to maintain up until Donald Trump was elected, was a good thing. You know, realists and liberals. Realists and liberals didn't fight over economic issues, and they didn't fight over institutions either. Liberals tend to love institutions, but realists really kind of love institutions too, right? So economics, institutions, there's no real divergence. I think it's the politics. But as we're going along here, if something pops into my mind, I'll tell you. Sir.
Can you say a word about China's strategy? Seems like they've been doing economic hegemony. They've been doing it in Africa. They've been doing it with us in terms of the currency manipulation. Do you see that as a prelude to a political aspiration, or are they really changing the rules of how states will interact with each other?
I don't believe the Chinese are changing the rules. I believe that the Chinese are interested in dominating Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. I believe that they will ultimately try to push us out of East Asia. They will tell you behind closed doors, many of their elites, that they intend to push us out beyond the first island chain and then beyond the second island chain. They intend to build a blue water navy that can project power into the Persian Gulf, because they get 25% of their oil from the Gulf, and that number is expected to go up to close to 30% in the next 15 years. So they are very ambitious, right? And this is...
What are they doing in Africa with building...
Well, before I get to Africa, because I want to just, I'll come to Africa, but you raised a really very important point about what the Chinese are up to, right? And not so much in Africa, just in terms of what they're doing more generally with regard to using military force. The key point you want to keep in mind about the Chinese is that time is on their side, and therefore they have no interest in causing trouble now. The name of the game for them is just to grow and grow and grow. And then when they become Godzilla, tell all the neighbors and tell Uncle Sam, right, here are the new rules in the neighborhood. You have no choice but to obey us, right? We, on the other hand, and China's neighbors, on the other hand, have a vested interest in provoking conflicts and setting the rules of the road now, when the balance of power is in our favor. You understand, the balance of power is shifting against us in East Asia. So all the incentives are for us to make it clear where we think the lines in the South China Sea are. Now, the Chinese, on the other hand, should just say nothing. They should speak like good liberal Americans. Peace, love, and dope, right? And then just keep that economy growing and keep translating that economic might into military might. It's like Taiwan. You know, the Chinese want Taiwan back. And they made it clear to the Taiwanese that at some point they're going to take it back if the Taiwanese don't surrender. But now's not the time for China to pick a fight over Taiwan. They'd do much better today in the year 2017 than they would have done in the year 1997. You ramp it back 20 years, it would not have been a fair fight over Taiwan. Chinese would have fared very badly. They'd fare quite well today. But I say wait another 20 years. Wait another 30 years. And the Chinese are very patient, they'll tell you that. 30 years from now, you just basically tell the Taiwanese they have no choice. It's all over, ladies and gentlemen. You understand that this is what happened with the British in North America? You understand that after we got our independence in 1783, the British went to great lengths to try to prevent us from dominating the Western Hemisphere. They did not want a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. They couldn't prevent it. They thought about intervening in the American Civil War. Because what you do if you intervene in the Civil War, on the side of the South, of course, is you get a Confederacy and the United States. Right? You have two countries. That's what they wanted. They wanted a balance of power. But what happened with the British is they reached the point where they understood there was nothing they could do to prevent the United States from dominating the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, they were lucky it turned out that way, because we pulled their chestnuts out of the fire in World War I and again in World War II. But they couldn't foresee that. Anyway, I would say to you, I think in the case of China, given the size of that population, they have a per capita GNP that looks anything like Taiwan or South Korea. They are going to be so powerful relative to us, and we're taking them on 6,000 miles from the from the California coast. Whew. So the Chinese are trying to sit still, not do too much to provoke their neighbors or provoke the United States, and just grow and grow and grow. Now, your question about Africa. Africa is an area of little strategic significance, right? It's of little strategic significance. So even though the Chinese are doing all sorts of investment in Africa, and they're deeply involved in Africa, we don't care that much. If, on the other hand, the Chinese start to do that in South America, you know the Monroe Doctrine, right? They start to do that in South America, that'll be a very different story, right? So I think we'll not have major problems with what they're doing in Africa. The Gulf, remember I told you they're building a blue water navy going into the Gulf. Well, I'm on stream of consciousness mode here. Iran, Turkey, the Chinese are playing kissy face with the Iranians and the Turks. The United States is foolishly driving the Iranians into the arms of the Chinese, right? Don't want to do that. You're going to want to minimize Chinese influence in the Persian Gulf. And given our relations with the Iranians and given our growing relations with the Chinese, don't want to push them together. Same thing is true with the Turks. But that's, Persian Gulf, important area, unless this gentleman's view on the Gulf is correct. Africa just doesn't matter that much.
So you mentioned Russia, Japan, and Germany as declining powers, and China being in the future probably the only country that can legitimately challenge the United States as a peer competitor. And so my question was, why is your prediction that we're headed towards multipolarity instead of bipolarity, and what are the implications of that?
Well, I think that Russia will be a weak great power, right? That would be my argument. I wish I could give you simple indicators that measure power. And I wish I could say, I've done the calculations, and the Chinese will have 50 units of power, we'll have 49 units of power, and they'll have 21, but they're above the threshold of 20. But it's very hard. It's not very hard. It's impossible to do that. But my basic argument is that you will end up with multipolarity with two big enchiladas and one small player, but still a great power. And that will be the Russians. It may be the case that we do end up in a bipolar world, which is, I think, what you were hinting at. Yes, ma'am. No, yes.
I just have a brief question.
Could you talk a little bit louder, please?
I just have a brief question about,
Okay.
Because there's a hot topic in China about the global leadership. And scholars in China tends to talk about this topic, whether China will become a global leadership, will take over the U.S. leadership. And last time when Chang Hager here gave a lecture, he said that he thinks that China has no capabilities nor willingness to lead the world. And in our class, and Nuno said that, Professor Montero said that even China is now has economic advantage, but in current U.S. leadership, U.S. does not threaten China to develop their economy. So China has no intention to develop their military, and in this case, China is not going to be a military hegemony, so that will not threaten U.S.
Who says that?
From Montero.
I'll have to talk to him.
Power, so he doesn't think that China will become a great power as U.S. is.
Okay.
So about the global leadership,
Yeah, let me make a number of points to your excellent questions. When I go to China, I often pose this question to my interlocutors. I say, look, you folks got hooked on capitalism and you joined the American-led order in the early 1980s. And if you look at what's happened since then, you've just got richer and richer and richer. You're really in a wonderful position, and you have benefited enormously from participating in this American-led order. Moreover, the Americans pay the costs of maintaining the order, right? You don't have to pay the costs. And in no way, shape, or form does the US military threaten you. So why don't you just sort of sit back and relax and accept the fact that we run the world and just get rich? I have never met a single Chinese who likes that argument, right? They don't like that argument. Now, 2 points. One, just let's talk about let's talk about institutions. When you talk about the liberal order or you talk about international order, order is all about institutions. The Chinese, not surprisingly, are interested in, number one, creating new institutions that they run. The AIIB fits in this category. And they're also interested in increasing their influence in existing institutions. The Chinese ambassador to the United States, who I know very well from way back when, he has written in Foreign Affairs that, look, when these institutions were created, mainly by the United States, China had no say in the rules. And therefore, the rules privilege the United States. You all understand when the United States creates institutions, they're set up to privilege us. Others benefit too, but mainly us. Well, the Chinese are getting really powerful, so they say, we should be able to rewrite the rules. Okay? And with regard to the South China Sea, you've been watching what the Chinese do in the South China Sea? That doesn't look like a status quo power to me. You watching what they're doing in the East China Sea with regard to the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands? That doesn't look like a status quo power to me. They're building a blue water navy. They're spending one heck of a lot of money on defense, right? This is not a status quo power. This is a power that wants to throw its weight around. And I don't blame them one bit. You remember what happened to the Chinese when they were weak, right? The century of national humiliation, 1850 to 1950 roughly. You don't want to be weak. The Chinese understand this full well. They want to be really powerful. They want to be Godzilla. They want to be up here, and they want the Japanese down here, and they want the Americans on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And I don't blame them one bit. I like the Monroe Doctrine, so why shouldn't they? Right? This is my view of the Chinese. Right. Now, just with regard to leadership, are they going to be the global leader? Given Donald Trump's performance up to now, it kind of looks like that may happen if China continues to grow and he's in power for 8 years. But I would just say to you, the United States is not going to surrender easily to the Chinese. Right? The United States is a jealous God, and the United States will go to great lengths to remain the top dog in East Asia and prevent China from dominating East Asia. And the end result is that to the extent that you have an order in the international system, an international order, it's not going to be an American-dominated order if China continues to grow. The two of them, the Chinese and the Americans, will compete to run that order. And that's the world I see sort of in front of us, not one where the United States dominates and not one where China dominates. And of course, this all assumes that China continues to grow economically. Sir?
Yeah, so my question, I guess, follows on the last one. And it's, have we already passed the point where China's rise to great power status, barring some demographic crisis or major fumble by the Chinese, can be stopped? And
when you say can be stopped, you mean can be stopped by the United States?
So the second part of the question is, if not, what could the United States do to bring that about? And either way, whether or not it can be stopped, how concerned are you that the policies you seem to advocate for here trade a high likelihood for small wars for maybe a low likelihood of a great power?
I don't understand the last part of the question.
So if we shift our focus from sort of dilly-dallying around in places that don't matter, right? You know, conducting operations in 50 of 54 African countries, and
Yeah.
instead say like, we're going to try and stop the rise of China.
Contain China.
Right? What does Chinese containment do? One, do you think there's a chance it could work? And two, what do you think it does about the chance of
Oh, I
great
see what you're
power
saying.
war?
Yeah, good. Okay. I think, look, that if China continues to rise, as I was indicating in response to the young woman's question, I think there's no question that the United States will try to contain China. And then you raise the specter of, now we're talking about a great power war, John. We're not talking about small wars in the periphery. I think you're exactly right. I think that containment against China will be dangerous. I can just unpack that a bit for you. If you think about the Cold War, the Central Front in Europe was the principal place that we thought a war would break out between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the truth is, when we used to run war games during the Cold War, we could never get a war started in Europe. And the reason is you had two massive armies armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And nobody knew for sure what would happen when they crashed into each other. But it was very easy to paint plausible scenarios where we all got vaporized. And that's not a good thing. So you had no war, right? This gets to this great paradox that underpins deterrence, which is the more horrible a war is likely to be, the less likely you'll have that war to begin with. But of course, if the war happens, oh my God. Okay, but fast forward to East Asia today, the United States and China. The potential points of conflict are the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan. You can imagine plausible scenarios where we end up shooting at each other. We end up in a war. I'm not arguing for 1 second it's likely, right? But I'm just building on your point, which I think is correct, that, liberal hegemony, for all its faults, involves small wars where not that many Americans die. And if you get into a serious containment effort against China, the potential for real trouble is great. Sure.
I think I understand the liberal institutionist policy restrictions for avoiding war in the South China Sea. Graham Allison's work was a pretty good example, I think. What is the structural realist or the offensive realist policy prescription for avoiding it? If it's so likely, the direct foreign investment in South America already exceeds, from the last time I checked, what it does in Africa from China. They're slicing the salami in the South China Sea. They might take a rock in the Senkakus, like you were saying. What is the policy prescription to not have total war?
Well, I don't think you're going to have total war. As I was saying to this gentleman here, I think you're more likely to have a limited war out in the water. It is possible that it could escalate to a total war, although I think that's quite unlikely. Look, I don't have a good answer to how you avoid war, other than to say you want to make sure you have sufficient forces to make the other side think that they can't start a war and succeed at achieving their objectives. You want to go to great lengths yourself to make sure that you don't engage in rollback. You don't want to do rollback, you want to do containment. There's this whole literature on the Cold War now that shows we did a lot more than containment. We were heavily into rollback, which is very offensive in nature. I don't think you want to engage in rollback. This is a form of restraint in a competition with the Chinese. So you want to do things like that, but can you be sure that you won't have a war? The answer is no. And again, as I said to this gentleman here, I think you can paint a plausible picture of how you get a war.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Can you explain to me what to make of the new term that the administration now uses, Indo-Pacific instead of
Indo-Pacific?
In the Pacific, that, our president used that term when he was traveling in Asia. I suppose that comes from Tillerson's State Department. Does that make any, does that have any significance?
Gee, I hadn't heard the term, and it's kind of hard to figure out what it might mean. When I hear the word Indo, I think of Indonesia, but Indonesia is not, likely to, Indo.
I thought it put in more India instead of. I have tried to make sense of it. I found nowhere.
Sounds like a task for Wikipedia.
It's increasing, sorry.
It may be next in Nambia.
Did somebody have a question?
I had a question on the nature of future coexistence between two emerging world powers, the United States and China. In the case of the Cold War, you actually have parallel structures. That is, the Soviet Union and their allies, etc., who didn't really interact. So the two economies were not intertwined at all.
Yeah,
They're two totally separate systems.
for sure.
The difference in this is that you now have at least the economic activity in the world very highly intertwined. And so you have more places for interaction and therefore competition and leadership of institutions. So that, say, in the economic institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, etc., they were out. So the issue of competition didn't arise. in
Okay.
these institutions. Now they're all there together.
Good. Okay, I'll answer your question. With regard to, you remind me, after I'm done with him, I want to go back and just deal with one issue. It was very important that you raised, but it slipped out of my brain. Just say Britain, Germany when I point to you, okay? Because I'll forget. It's early Alzheimer's. With regard to his question, great question. Let me just embellish it a bit. He's comparing the U.S.-Soviet competition with a U.S.-China competition. And he's making the argument that what's really different is you have economic interdependence, right, today, and you had virtually no economic interdependence during the Cold War. And he's absolutely right. And as many of you know, one of the principal liberal theories of peace is economic interdependence theory. I've given my talk on why China cannot rise peacefully probably 150 times, and probably 50 times in China. And I get three counter arguments. People come at me, as always happens in these things. People come at me. And the argument that is used against me 90% of the time is the economic interdependence argument. The reason that John is wrong and a U.S.-China situation is different than a U.S.-Soviet situation is because there was no economic interdependence then and there is now. So that is the argument. I'm not going to knock the argument down, or let me put it differently. I'm not going to try to knock the argument down, but I don't agree with that argument as you would expect. But that is an argument that I think is the principal competitor. But let me make just another point, because this is a very important subject. This is another argument that you occasionally hear, and that is that the Cold War had a really vicious ideological dimension to it. It was communism versus liberal democracy / capitalism. And basically what you're going to get, because communism is not a meaningful ideology in China, is you're just going to get good old-fashioned great power politics, right? And so we don't have to worry very much about ideology fueling the conflict between China and the United States as we had to during the Cold War. My counter to that, which I'll just point out because it ties into nationalism, is that because the Communist Party does not have a lot of legitimacy in Beijing or in China more generally, they've begun to play the nationalism card in a big way. And their nationalism card centers on, as I was saying to this young woman here, the century of national humiliation. The Chinese really drive home the century of national humiliation. And who are the two principal humiliators in the story? Japan and the United States. And nationalism is a very powerful force so you get into a crisis. You could have that ideological dimension really matter, even though communism, as in the Cold War, is not there. I just want to say, he asked an excellent question, but it slipped out of my mind. You asked whether there was...
Carpet.
Pardon?
The carpet.
No, you asked the question about whether there was anything we could do to stop China's rise. And the answer is, there's nothing we can do to stop China's rise. And I had a guy who wrote a dissertation on this for me. He actually teaches at Yale, Singapore. But let me just say a few words on this. What he did was he looked at how Britain dealt with Germany's rise. You understand that Germany doesn't exist until 1870. There's no Germany until 1870. It's Prussia and a handful of other German places like Bavaria. And Bismarck, with 3 wars, 1864, 1866, 1870, puts Germany together. And then the Germans are making huge numbers of babies, and they're making lots of steel. So the British, from 1870 forward, see Germany rising. And the question is, what do you do about it, right? I believe the crossover point is 1905. Do you try and strangle the baby in the cradle, right? And the British, not surprisingly, have a huge debate on this issue. What can we do to stop Germany's rise? And given what happened in World War I and World War II, it might have been a good idea if they'd been able to stop it. But what the British come to conclude is, given the economic interdependence of the day, the British come to conclude that in trying to wreck the German economy, they would do more damage to their own economy than they would to the German economy. And my student argues that, yes, we could do a great deal to wreck the Chinese economy and prevent their rise, but we would do more damage to ourselves than we would to the Chinese. So there's no way to slow down Chinese economic growth from our side. I mean, it may happen for internal reasons in China, but there's nothing we can do. And therefore, the best we can do is to contain China, and then we get down to this whole question that you and the gentleman in the rear raised about whether or not you can do that peacefully. And that is a tricky issue.
So before we draw things to a close, and thanks Professor Mearsheimer, I just want to say there will be a reception upstairs on the 2nd floor immediately following this lecture, to which everybody's invited to continue the conversation. I've been to many lecture series at Yale. Usually, by the time we get to the 3rd lecture, there's a real question, will there be an audience? Will the people run out of questions? Will it sort of fade away? None of those things have happened here. I think we could have a 4th and a 5th.
Don't we have another half hour?
But this has really been terrific. We're all looking forward to the book, and thank you so much for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.